The thermometer outside Henrik Larsen's snow chamber read 28 degrees below zero on the 10th consecutive night of the cold snap. But inside his underground shelter, warmth radiated from the stone floor and earthen walls as steadily as it had the previous 9 nights. Other prospectors 3 miles down the valley had abandoned their claims 2 days earlier, their cabins burning through firewood faster than they could cut it, the cold seeping through every gap in their log walls, no matter how desperately they fed their fires. Before we dig into Henrik's story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and if you love tales of frontier ingenuity that saved lives, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story might be even more impossible than this one. Henrik Larsen found his partner on the morning of February 3, 1852. Thomas Bergstrom was sitting upright in his bunk, blankets pulled to his chin, frozen solid. The cabin's interior temperature had dropped to just above freezing, despite the fact that Henrik had stoked the fire before going to check their sluice boxes at dawn. When he returned, 2 hours later, the fire had burned down to coals, and Thomas was dead. The shock wasn't that Thomas had died. Men died in the Colorado high country with brutal regularity. The shock was that it had happened inside their cabin, with firewood stacked against the wall, with shelter from the wind, with every advantage civilized men believed they needed to survive. Thomas had simply gone to sleep and not generated enough body heat to compensate for the cold radiating through the log walls. By the time hypothermia set in deep enough to wake him, he was already too confused and weak to rebuild the fire. He died 20 feet from fuel and matches, defeated by physics he didn't understand. Henrik was 31 years old, a Norwegian immigrant who had worked as a carpenter in Chicago before gold fever pulled him west. He understood wood and basic construction, but until that morning he had never truly considered why frontier cabins were so ineffective at retaining heat. He had accepted, as most men did, that winter meant constant fire tending, that staying warm required burning massive amounts of wood, that frozen mornings and cold nights were simply the price of mountain life. He buried Thomas on a hillside overlooking their claim, breaking through 8 inches of frozen soil with a pickaxe, then digging down 3 feet in earth that resisted every shovel stroke. The work took most of the day. As he dug, Henrik thought about the cabin they had built the previous summer. It had taken them 4 days. They had notched logs at the corners, chinked the gaps with mud and moss, hung a door on leather hinges, and considered the job complete. The structure kept out rain and broke the wind. That was enough, or so they had believed. That night, alone in the cabin, Henrik fed the fire every 2 hours and barely slept. Each time he woke. The temperature had dropped despite the flames. He could feel cold air moving along the floor, finding every gap in the chinked walls, stealing heat faster than the fire could produce it. By dawn, he had burned through half a week's supply of firewood and still spent the night shivering under 3 blankets. Thomas's death had revealed something Henrik couldn't ignore. Their cabin was fundamentally inadequate. No amount of wood could compensate for its failures. Henrik continued working his claim through February and into March, but mining became secondary to a growing obsession with heat loss and fuel consumption. He began keeping careful records in a small journal he had brought from Chicago. Each evening, he counted how many logs he burned. Each morning, he noted the interior temperature and how many times he had woken to feed the fire. The numbers told a story that most prospectors never bothered to calculate. A single night required 12 to 15 logs, each roughly 16 inches in diameter and 2 feet long. A week consumed 84 to 105 logs. A month demanded somewhere between 360 and 450 logs, which translated to roughly 3 cords of firewood. Winter in the high country lasted 5 months, sometimes 6. Henrik calculated that surviving from November through April required 15 to 18 cords of wood, and that assumed average cold, not the killing temperatures that had taken Thomas. Cutting that much wood was a full-time occupation. Henrik spent entire days doing nothing but felling trees, limbing them, cutting them to length, splitting the larger pieces, and hauling everything back to the cabin. For every hour he spent mining, he spent 3 hours gathering fuel. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. A prospector couldn't get rich if he spent most of his time just trying not to freeze. Other prospectors in the district faced the same problem, but accepted it as unchangeable reality. Henrik began visiting their camps during supply trips, paying attention to their cabins and asking questions about fuel consumption. Everyone had the same complaints. The fire had to be fed constantly. If you let it die down, the cabin interior dropped to near freezing within an hour. Some men had tried building larger fireplaces, but that just meant burning even more wood. Others had chinked their walls more carefully, but gaps always opened as the logs dried and settled. One prospector named Albert Chen, a Chinese immigrant working a claim along Bear Creek, showed Henrik his cabin walls. Albert had mixed clay with horsehair and packed it between the logs, creating chinking that was superior to standard mud and moss. Henrik examined it closely, noting how the horsehair reinforced the clay and prevented cracking. But even Albert's cabin, with its excellent chinking, still consumed massive amounts of firewood. The fundamental problem wasn't gaps between logs. The problem was the logs themselves. Wood was not a good insulator when used in the thickness required for structural walls. A log 8 to 10 inches in diameter provided minimal resistance to heat transfer. Cold air on the exterior surface conducted directly through to the interior surface. The larger the cabin, the more surface area existed for heat to escape. Every square foot of wall was stealing warmth and radiating it into the winter night. Henrik started noticing patterns in temperature loss that he had previously accepted without question. The coldest spot in any cabin was always along the floor near exterior walls. Heat rose to the ceiling while cold air pooled at ground level, creating circulation that made sleeping near walls uncomfortable. The roof, typically made of poles and bark, was another massive heat sink. Warm air rose and pressed against the underside of the roof, where it lost heat to the cold air above. Some prospectors tried to insulate their roofs with extra layers of bark or hides, but the improvement was marginal. Henrik made a supply trip to Bennett's trading post in late March, a journey that required 2 days of travel through melting snow and muddy trails. The post sat at a lower elevation where spring arrived earlier, and Henrik needed flour, coffee, salt pork, and black powder for blasting. He also needed to escape the cabin where Thomas had died, even if only for a few days. Bennett's was a rough log structure that served as general store, saloon, and occasional hotel for prospectors and trappers passing through the region. Marcus Bennett, the proprietor, was a former fur trader who had recognized that selling supplies to miners was more profitable and considerably safer than trapping beaver. He ran his business with efficiency and kept prices reasonable enough that men returned rather than making the longer journey to Denver. Henrik arrived in the afternoon and spent an hour selecting supplies and arranging for them to be packed for transport. As he was settling his account, Marcus mentioned that he had fresh eggs available, a luxury in mining country where chickens were rare and eggs commanded premium prices. Henrik asked where the eggs were kept, and Marcus led him around behind the trading post to a small structure Henrik had never noticed before. It was a root cellar, built into the hillside behind the main building. The entrance was a heavy wooden door set at an angle into the slope with earth mounded over the top. Marcus pulled the door open and gestured for Henrik to follow him down 4 steps into the underground space. Henrik expected damp cold, the kind of raw chill associated with caves and basements. Instead, he found the air surprisingly mild, almost comfortable compared to the exterior temperature. The cellar was roughly 8 feet wide and 12 feet long, excavated directly into the hillside. The walls were bare earth, compacted and stable. The ceiling was log beams covered with planks over which earth had been mounded to a depth Henrik estimated at 2 feet. Shelves lined both sides, holding sacks of potatoes, bins of carrots and turnips, crocks of preserved butter, and several baskets of eggs. A few candles provided light. There was no fire, no stove, no heat source of any kind. Henrik stood in the center of the cellar and realized he was warmer than he had been in his cabin with a fire burning. He touched the earthen wall. It was cool but not cold, perhaps 45 or 50 degrees. The air was still, with none of the drafts that plagued every cabin he had ever occupied. Marcus retrieved a basket of eggs and noticed Henrik's fascination with the space. "Stays this temperature year-round," Marcus explained. "Winter, summer, doesn't matter. Never freezes down here, never gets hot. Potatoes last all winter without sprouting. Butter stays firm. Eggs keep for weeks." Henrik asked how deep the cellar went. Marcus said the floor was about 4 feet below the exterior ground level. He had dug it 7 years earlier, spending a week with a pick and shovel. The effort had been worth it. Food that would spoil or freeze in the trading post remained perfectly preserved underground. "Why doesn't it freeze?" Henrik asked. Marcus shrugged. "Ground doesn't freeze this deep. My father built root cellars back in Pennsylvania," said the earth below frost line stays warm all year. Not warm like a fire, but warm enough. Henrik descended the steps again after Marcus had returned to the trading post. He spent 20 minutes examining the construction, feeling the walls, studying how the space had been created. The implications were forming in his mind like crystals growing in cold water. Henrik returned to his claim in early April with a plan that seemed insane by conventional prospecting standards. Instead of spending spring and summer mining, he would dig a hole in the ground and live in it. He selected a location 50 yards from his current cabin, on a south-facing hillside that received maximum sunlight during winter months. The slope was gentle enough for easy access, but steep enough to provide natural drainage away from the excavation. He began digging on April 10, 1852. The ground had thawed enough at the surface to make excavation possible, though he still encountered frozen earth below 18 inches. He used a pickaxe to break up compacted soil and a shovel to remove it, piling the excavated earth nearby for later use in roof construction. The work was brutal and slow. In a full day of labor, he could excavate roughly 2 cubic yards of earth. Other prospectors noticed his efforts within the first week. A man named Samuel Morrison stopped by on his way to check trap lines and watched Henrik digging for several minutes before speaking. "You building a grave?" Morrison asked. Henrik explained he was constructing an underground shelter, something like a root cellar, but designed for living rather than storage. Morrison listened with an expression that suggested he was watching a man lose his mind. "Why in hell would you live in a hole when there's timber everywhere?" Morrison gestured at the surrounding forest. 4 days, and you'd have a proper cabin." Henrik tried to explain the thermal properties of Earth, how underground spaces maintained stable temperatures, how a structure surrounded by soil would require a fraction of the firewood a cabin needed. Morrison cut him off. "You do know you're crazy, right? Living underground like some kind of animal." He shook his head and walked away. 2 more prospectors visited over the following weeks, both offering similar opinions. One suggested Henrik had been alone too long after Thomas's death and needed to spend time around other people. Another said the altitude was affecting Henrik's judgment and recommended he work a lower elevation claim. Henrik stopped trying to explain. He simply continued digging. By early May, he had excavated a space 10 feet wide, 12 feet long, and 4 feet deep at the center. The excavation sloped slightly toward the entrance to facilitate drainage. He had removed approximately 13 cubic yards of earth, which he estimated weighed around 26,000 pounds. His hands were calloused and his back ached constantly, but the chamber was taking shape exactly as he had envisioned. He dug the entrance as a gradual ramp rather than steps, making it easier to haul materials in and out. The walls were rough but stable, showing no signs of collapse. He compacted the floor by walking over it repeatedly and sprinkling water to settle the soil. The space looked like nothing more than a large pit, but Henrik saw it differently. He saw the foundation of a shelter that would make Thomas's death mean something, a structure that would prove frontier construction could be better than what tradition dictated. Other prospectors continued to call it Larsen's folly. Henrik called it progress. Henrik spent the first week of May cutting and hauling timber for the entrance frame. He needed logs substantial enough to support the earth-covered roof that would span the excavation. Most cabin builders selected trees based on convenience and proximity. Henrik selected based on structural requirements. He wanted straight-grained pine or fir, approximately 10 inches in diameter, with minimal taper and no significant knots that would create weak points. He found 4 suitable trees within a quarter-mile of his excavation and spent 2 days felling them, limbing them, and dragging them to the site using rope and leverage. Each log was cut to precise lengths. 2 vertical posts would serve as door jambs, standing 6 feet tall. A horizontal lintel beam would span the entrance, and additional beams would extend from the lintel back into the hillside to support the roof structure. The vertical posts were set into holes. Henrik dug 18 inches deep, positioned exactly 3 feet apart. He packed earth and stones around their bases, creating stable footings that wouldn't shift under load. The lintel beam was notched to sit securely atop the posts, creating a rigid frame. He used wooden pegs driven through drilled holes to lock the joints together, a technique he had learned during his carpentry years in Chicago. While the timber frame took shape, Henrik began collecting stones. This task required more careful selection than most prospectors would consider necessary. He needed river stones worn smooth by water, specifically granite and quartzite. Certain types of stone, particularly those containing moisture or specific mineral compositions, would explode when subjected to repeated heating and cooling. Henrik had witnessed a fireplace stone shatter in a trader's cabin years earlier, sending fragments across the room like shrapnel. He walked the creek beds within a mile of his claim, selecting stones based on density, composition, and size. He wanted smooth river cobbles ranging from the size of his fist to the size of his head, hard stones that rang with a clear tone when struck together. Softer sandstones and any stone with visible cracks or layering were rejected. He hauled the stones back in a canvas sack, making dozens of trips over the course of a week. Inside the excavation, Henrik created a stone floor along the back half of the chamber. He fitted the river cobbles together like puzzle pieces, placing them directly on the compacted earth floor and filling gaps with smaller stones and gravel. The resulting surface was uneven but solid, creating a thermal mass that would absorb and store heat from fires burned above it. In one corner, he built a small fireplace entirely of stone. The firebox was compact, perhaps 18 inches wide and deep, designed to burn small, efficient fires rather than the massive blazes required in cabin fireplaces. He constructed a simple chimney from stacked flat stones, mortared with clay he had dug from a deposit near the creek. The chimney extended upward at a slight angle, eventually emerging through what would become the roof. The work consumed 3 weeks. Other prospectors who passed by continued their mockery. Henrik worked alone and said nothing in response. The roof was the most critical element of Henrik's design and the component that would determine whether his snow chamber succeeded or failed. Traditional cabin roofs were simple affairs built for speed rather than performance. Prospectors laid poles across wall logs, covered them with bark or split planks, and considered the job finished. Such roofs leaked during rain, lost heat constantly, and required regular maintenance. Henrik intended to build something that would last decades and provide insulation superior to any cabin in the territory. He began by cutting additional logs to serve as primary roof beams. These spanned from the entrance lintel to the back wall of the excavation, a distance of 12 feet. He selected logs 8 inches in diameter and notched them to sit securely on both the timber frame and the back earthen wall. He spaced the beams 18 inches apart, creating a robust framework capable of supporting enormous weight. Most cabin builders would have considered this excessive, but Henrik was planning to place tons of earth and snow atop this structure. Across the primary beams, he laid split planks he had hewn from straight-grained pine using a froe and wooden mallet. The planks were rough but functional, each approximately 6 inches wide and an inch thick. He laid them perpendicular to the beams, with edges touching, creating a solid deck that covered the entire excavation. The planking alone took a week to produce and install, far longer than an entire cabin would require, but Henrik worked methodically, fitting each piece carefully. Over the planking, he laid sheets of birch bark he had harvested from trees along the creek. Birch bark was naturally waterproof and flexible, characteristics that made it valuable for canoe construction and roofing applications. He overlapped the sheets like shingles, each layer covering the seams of the layer below, creating a continuous waterproof membrane. He secured the bark with wooden pegs driven through into the planking beneath. The next layer was earth mixed with clay. Henrik had experimented with different ratios and settled on approximately 3 parts soil to 1 part clay, moistened enough to be workable but not soupy. He spread this mixture over the birch bark to a depth of 6 inches, using a flat board to compact and smooth it. The clay-soil mixture would dry into a hard, waterproof shell that would seal any gaps the bark missed. Over the clay layer, Henrik piled the earth he had excavated from the chamber interior. He built up the soil to a depth of 18 inches, sloping it gently to match the hillside contour. The mounded earth blended the structure into the landscape, making it nearly invisible from a distance. The weight was substantial, perhaps 8 to 10 tons total, but the robust beam structure supported it without visible deflection. Henrik left the roof low, just 6 feet at the center point. A tall ceiling would have been more comfortable but would create unnecessary interior volume that would require more heat. Every cubic foot of air inside the chamber was air that needed warming. Minimizing volume was essential for thermal efficiency. Henrik moved into his snow chamber on November 18, 1852. The structure had taken 7 months to complete, an investment of time that most prospectors would have considered absurd for simple shelter. He carried his supplies down the entrance ramp in multiple trips: bedding, cooking utensils, food stores, tools, and the few personal possessions he had brought west from Chicago. He arranged everything carefully in the underground space, which felt strangely quiet after months of working in open air. The chamber was dark except for light entering through the doorway and the small ventilation opening he had left at the top of the stone chimney. He lit a candle and examined his work. The stone floor gleamed dully in the flickering light. The earthen walls showed tool marks from excavation, but were smooth and stable. The roof beams overhead were solid, showing no sagging, despite the tons of earth pressing down on them. Everything was ready for the critical test. He had built a crude door from split planks, held together with crosspieces, heavy enough to block wind, but not yet the reinforced barrier he planned to construct eventually. For now, it would suffice. He closed it and felt the chamber's atmosphere change immediately. The constant air movement that characterized every cabin he had occupied simply stopped. The space became still and quiet in a way that felt almost unnatural. Henrik built his first fire at midday. He arranged kindling in the stone firebox, struck a spark with flint and steel, and nursed the flames until they caught properly. He added larger pieces of wood gradually, building a fire that was modest by cabin standards but substantial for the small firebox. The flames licked upward and smoke rose through the chimney, drawing cleanly without backdrafts or spillage into the chamber. He fed the fire steadily for 6 hours, maintaining consistent flames and adding wood whenever the fire threatened to die down. He wasn't trying to create intense heat, but rather sustained moderate warmth. The stone floor beneath and around the firebox grew warm to the touch, then hot enough that standing on it barefoot became uncomfortable. The earthen walls nearest the fire warmed noticeably. Heat radiated outward from the stone, filling the chamber with wind warmth that felt different from cabin heat, less fierce but more pervasive. At dusk, Henrik let the fire die. He added no more wood, simply allowed the flames to consume what remained and fade to coals, then to ash. The chamber's temperature remained comfortable. He ate a cold supper and prepared for sleep, wrapping himself in blankets on a sleeping platform he had built from poles and canvas. He woke once during the night and felt the stone floor. It was still warm, radiating heat upward. The air temperature had dropped but remained far warmer than any cabin he had experienced hours after a fire died. He checked his pocket watch by candlelight. 12 hours had passed since he had stopped feeding the fire. The chamber was still holding heat. His innovation was working. Henrik spent December refining his understanding of the snow chamber's thermal behavior. Each day became an experiment in heat management and efficiency. He discovered that a single fire, burned for 4 to 5 hours during midday, could maintain comfortable interior temperatures for an entire 24-hour period. This was revolutionary compared to cabin living, where fires required constant attention and feeding every few hours to prevent interior temperatures from plummeting. He developed a routine. Each morning after waking, he would rebuild the fire using dry wood he kept stacked near the entrance. He burned pine and fir, selecting pieces that were seasoned and free of excessive moisture. The fire heated the stone floor and the surrounding earth, storing thermal energy that would radiate back throughout the following night. By early afternoon, the stones would be hot enough that he had to wear boots to walk near the firebox. He would let the fire die naturally in late afternoon, then spend evenings by candlelight, while warmth continued emanating from the floor and walls. The fuel consumption was remarkable. Henrik used approximately 4 to 6 logs per day, roughly 1/10 of what his previous cabin had required. A week's worth of firewood could be gathered in a single afternoon. He spent his days mining rather than hauling fuel, finally able to focus on the work that had brought him to the mountains in the first place. He experimented with stone placement, moving some of the river cobbles closer to the firebox to increase their heat absorption. He adjusted the door, adding strips of canvas around the frame to seal gaps and prevent cold air infiltration. He modified the chimney, adding a flat stone partway up the flue that created a smoke shelf, reflecting heat back into the chamber while still allowing smoke to escape efficiently. The ventilation required careful balance. Too much airflow would waste heat, but insufficient ventilation would lead to carbon monoxide accumulation and oxygen depletion. Henrik kept the chimney opening small and ensured the door had a narrow gap at the bottom, allowing fresh air to enter at floor level, while warm air and smoke exited through the chimney. The system created a gentle circulation that kept the air fresh without significant heat loss. Other prospectors began noticing Henrik's reduced firewood gathering. Albert Chen stopped by in mid-December and asked about the underground shelter. Henrik invited him inside, and Albert spent 20 minutes examining the construction, feeling the warm stone floor, studying the roof structure. He asked detailed questions about excavation depth, roof thickness, and stone selection. Unlike the earlier skeptics, Albert recognized functional engineering when he saw it. "This works better than any cabin," Albert said finally. "How much wood do you burn?" Henrik explained his daily routine and fuel consumption. Albert calculated the difference in his head and shook his head in amazement. "I spend half my time cutting wood," Albert said. "You're burning 1/10 of what I use. If I built something like this, I could actually work my claim." Henrik offered to help Albert excavate his own snow chamber when spring arrived. Albert accepted. The cold front arrived on January 7, 1853. Henrik woke to air so frigid that moisture from his breath crystallized instantly. He climbed out of his snow chamber and checked the thermometer he had mounted on a post outside the entrance. The mercury read 12 degrees below zero. By that evening, it had dropped to 18 below. The sky was clear and hard, stars visible in crystalline detail that only came with extreme cold. Henrik burned his usual midday fire, perhaps slightly larger than normal, but nothing extraordinary. He let it die in late afternoon and settled in for the night. The stone floor radiated heat steadily. The earthen walls, warmed over weeks of daily fires, released their stored thermal energy. The thick roof insulation prevented heat from escaping upward. The chamber remained comfortable while outside temperatures continued dropping. The second night reached 22 degrees below zero. The third night dropped to 26 below. Henrik maintained his routine, burning 1 fire per day, using perhaps 6 to 8 logs instead of his usual 4 to 6. The chamber's temperature stayed stable, fluctuating only slightly between day and night. He slept soundly, waking occasionally to feel the stone floor and confirm it was still radiating warmth. Other prospectors were not faring as well. Samuel Morrison, the man who had mocked Henrik's excavation, burned through 5 days' worth of firewood in the first 2 nights. He spent entire days cutting timber, hauling it back to his cabin, feeding fires that consumed wood faster than he could supply it. His cabin interior never rose above 40 degrees, despite constant flames. By the 4th night, Morrison abandoned his claim and headed to lower elevations, unable to sustain the fuel demands. 2 prospectors 8 miles north ran out of firewood completely on the 5th night. They huddled together under every blanket they owned and survived until morning. But one man suffered severe frostbite on his feet and hands. They left the mountains the next day, the injured man riding while his partner walked beside the horse. Another man, a prospector Henrik had met only once, died on the 7th night. His name was Robert Finch, and he had worked a claim near Bennett's trading post. He had fallen asleep while tending his fire, exhausted from days of constant wood gathering. The fire burned out. Interior temperature dropped below 0. Robert never woke. Other prospectors found him 3 days later when someone noticed his cabin showed no smoke. Henrik learned about these events gradually as survivors stopped at his claim seeking shelter or help. He gave them food, let them warm themselves in his snow chamber, and sent them on with what supplies he could spare. Each visitor stared in disbelief at the comfortable underground space, at the warm stone floor, at the minimal woodpile that had sustained Henrik through the same cold that had killed or driven away others. On the 10th night, temperature reached 28 degrees below 0. Henrik burned his daily fire, let it die, and slept through the night without waking once. The chamber stayed warm. The cold front broke on January 18th, and temperatures climbed back to more tolerable levels. Henrik emerged from his snow chamber and surveyed the surrounding landscape. Several cabins within 5 miles stood abandoned, their occupants having fled to lower elevations or given up entirely on winter prospecting. The district that had held 23 active claims in December now held fewer than 10. The cold had driven men away as effectively as any legal claim dispute or played-out gold vein. Word spread through the remaining prospectors about Henrik's survival and his unusual shelter. Men who had mocked his excavation efforts now arrived asking questions. How deep had he dug? What type of stones had he used? How thick was the roof? Henrik answered every question and offered to help anyone willing to invest the time in building their own snow chamber. Albert Chen was the first to commit. In late April, after spring runoff had moderated, Henrik helped him select a hillside location and begin excavation. Albert's snow chamber followed Henrik's design with minor modifications based on his specific site conditions. By November of 1853, Albert had a functional underground shelter that performed exactly as Henrik had promised. Over the next 3 years, 7 more prospectors in the district built snow chambers. Some followed Henrik's design precisely. Others adapted the principles to their circumstances, building partially underground structures or incorporating stone floors into traditional cabins. The technique spread organically, passed from one miner to another through demonstration rather than formal instruction. Men who had spent winters feeding fires constantly discovered they could burn 1 modest fire per day and sleep through cold nights without waking. The winter of 1854 brought another severe cold snap. 10 days of sub-zero temperatures that would have been catastrophic 5 years earlier. No one died. No one abandoned their claims. The prospectors with snow chambers burned through their cold weather fuel supplies and continued working. Those still living in traditional cabins struggled, but they now knew better alternatives existed and began planning their own underground shelters. Henrik continued prospecting until 1864, when declining gold yields and his own aging body convinced him to sell his claim and move to Denver. He was 43 years old, wealthy enough to retire comfortably, but not rich by boomtown standards. He purchased a small house and lived quietly, working occasionally as a carpenter when he needed activity more than income. He died in 1869 of pneumonia, 15 days after his 48th birthday. His funeral was attended by 11 people, none of whom knew about the snow chambers or understood that Henrik had changed how men survived in the high country. His gravestone in Denver's Riverside Cemetery listed his name, birth year, death year, and nothing else. But in the mountains, his snow chambers remained. Some were still occupied by miners who had learned the technique second-hand or third-hand. Others stood abandoned but intact, their stone floors and earthen walls solid after decades of weather. Prospectors and hunters occasionally sheltered in them, grateful for warmth without understanding whose innovation had made it possible. The chambers required no maintenance, no recognition, no credit. They simply worked, silent and effective, scattered through the Rockies like seeds Henrik had planted in 1852.